Welcome to the Cleverly Changing podcast. Our podcast is all about learning how to educate your kids. I'm one of the hosts, Elle, and this is episode 24. If you are a new listener, we are excited to have you join us. Welcome. I am an entrepreneur, mom to twin girls, and this podcast is not just for homeschool parents and their children, but for all parents who want to supplement their child's education. Our goal is to provide you with encouragement, insight about African history, and support as a parent and home educator. New episodes are uploaded bi-weekly, so please remember to subscribe and share. We also have a Patreon page that we would love for you to support. Visit the show notes page so that you can see how you can support this podcast so that we can continue it. Today's African proverb is, wealth, if you use it, comes to an end. Learning, if you use it, increases. And that's a Swahili proverb. It's now time for the word of the episode. Dun, dun.
Today's word of the episode is brought to you by the language Swahili. Kujishagulia means self-determination.
This is Cleverly Cultured Kids!
Welcome to the Cleverly Changing podcast. This is now the Cleverly Cultured Kids section, and we are talking to our girls about unschooling and deschooling. What does that mean?
I have no idea.
You have no idea? Amara, do you know what unschooling means? So if someone says, I'm not homeschooled, I'm unschooled, what do they mean by that?
I think that means that you're being homeschooled, but it just in a different way of saying I'm homeschooled.
Okay. So what would be different about it?
You're not okay. Well, I don't know.
Do you guys have a guess?
I think it's when you
When you don't really use a curriculum, you just let the child learn on their own.
So she said when you don't use a curriculum, you just let the child learn on their own. And that's definitely close. That's basically what it is. Like there isn't a set curriculum where the parent just buys these books that say like 6th grade, let's do all of this for 6th grade, and it's one particular company and they're just doing everything in those books to say they completed the grade. So that is definitely one way of looking at it. When someone says self-directed education, that they're learning in a self-directed way, what do you think they mean by that?
the child can like inquire on whatever topic they wish.
Yes. Does anybody else have an idea what being a self-directed learner is?
You're learning by yourself, but with a little bit of help, maybe.
Yeah. So you're learning about things that are important to you and things that interest you, and you're using that to help guide your educational experience. Do you think that your parents are your primary homeschool guide? Gives you an opportunity to unschool or learn in a self-directed way?
Not really. Not entirely.
I don't really know. I don't know. Like maybe, but maybe not.
So do you use a set curriculum?
Kind of.
What does kind of mean? Do you have a like a set books that you learn from for your grades?
Yes. Yeah, we do.
Where are those books?
At school, they don't give us books.
So pretty much
They
no.
teach us how to sing.
Never mind.
Or from the curriculum that they use.
Layla.
Okay, explain it.
So no.
So
Never mind.
you don't have a set curriculum.
Yeah. We don't.
But you do go to a co-op and they teach you certain lessons. So you're still learning information. You're still being guided and you're being presented with information and knowledge. So being unschooled, it doesn't mean that you're not learning at all, that you're just doing whatever. It means that you're learning things that are based on your own interest. What are some of the things, like when we talked about our goal setting, you guys kind of mentioned some things that were of interest to you. And do you feel like your parents are helping you follow those interests?
Entirely.
I mean, they're not like directly helping me in the goal rather than just buying me things to assist in it.
So yes, they don't necessarily do the things with you, but they will get you. So if you say, hey, I need this in order, let's say you want to be an artist. So I need these special canvases and paint brushes and things. Will your parents supply that?
Sometimes.
Right.
I agree with Maya sometimes.
Some
Because like everything isn't affordable, so like you gotta like improvise with other stuff so you can have
the tools you need.
yeah.
I think that's true. So, but you also have to think of it like this. If you ask and don't necessarily think if you ask, you're going to get it immediately, but you can ask and then you can give it some time. And within a certain amount of time, it can be provided. I think that's reasonable, right? Wouldn't you agree?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So do you know what deschooling is?
No.
I don't know what it means, but I think I have a guess.
Okay. What's your guess?
My guess is you were in like actual school, and then you were homeschooled.
Okay. And so that period in between going to a traditional school and being homeschooled, that in between period is kind of like a transition period. That is called deschooling. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
Okay, that's pretty accurate. And so in that process, you're trying to kind of unlearn the same structure that you may have done at school where the subjects were laid out at certain times separately and you went from class to class. And
Mhm.
because when you're at home, you may one day do math at 8 and then tomorrow you may do art. And then, it's not as stringent and as rigid based on rules for some homeschoolers, not all, but at home, it's not as it's not laid out in the same way as you would at school. And do you see the difference?
I can see the difference because I went to a traditional school before I was homeschooled, and there's obviously a difference because homeschooling, it means that you're figuring out a schedule that works for you instead of having to work around a school, like a traditional school schedule.
Right, because in a school, they have a lot of kids that they have to teach. So they have to come up with an efficient way to make sure everybody is getting that education. Whereas at home, the primary focus is on you and your siblings if you have siblings and not a whole classroom of kids. So that's what kind of makes it different, right? Did you, because I know you two, you didn't go to a traditional school, so you don't necessarily have a period of time where you've done deschooling. But for you, do you think that because you went to school and then after Christmas break, you just didn't go back, you started to homeschool. So do you feel like during the Christmas break that you were deschooled?
Is this question to me
Yes,
or?
because my girls, they never went to a traditional school.
So to be honest, I don't know.
So maybe you were being deschooled and you just didn't know, but you were given flexibility to kind of, because when you went to school, you had to go to bed at a certain time, you had to wake up at a certain time because you had to catch the school bus, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so when you were homeschooled, those time frames really changed in the way that you did things at home, and you noticed that, right?
Yeah, because like when you are in a traditional school, you're away from home for about 8 hours, and you don't have to work on for hours at a time. Whereas for homeschool, if you just like forget to do something, then you can either do it the next day and have an extra thing to do, or hurry up and finish that before you do whatever else you want to do in that day.
Okay. So here's a question for you girls. Is there something that you want to be able to learn while you're being homeschooled? So like, is there a particular interest that you have that you feel like your parents need to give you more time to explore that?
Not really. Mhm.
At the moment, I can't think of anything.
Okay. So what about you? No.
No.
Okay. So do you feel like you have a natural talent that you want to be able to cultivate? So for
No.
me, my natural talent is speaking. Like I like public speaking.
We can hear that in your voice.
And so
Expressive.
while I'm home and I'm coming up with activities for me to do, I sometimes look for speaking engagements and opportunities to use that talent. Now, I know that as just knowing you girls, I know that each of you have talents like creating different
You had to think about it for a second.
No, I was gonna say, I was wondering how to phrase it, like the little the art things that you create on your phone. What are they, like emojis, and you create like graphic
They're called
designs?
edits.
No.
Edits? What are they called?
So pretty much they're
No,
called
okay, edits are different. Edits are like pictures,
I don't
or
make edits.
pictures that you
I
transitions with, and you put music with it.
I draw on my phone. I don't make edits because I don't know how and I don't really know what they are. I draw on my phone, and yeah, I don't make emojis. That doesn't make sense. You can't really make emojis.
Well,
Actually, you can, but if I were to make emojis, I would need an iPad with the Apple Pencil
Okay. So
or an app
I
that
know
needs
that you
money.
girls, you make things on a computer and they're very creative.
I don't.
Do you feel like you should be cultivating that skill?
It's easy.
well,
I'm
we normally do that.
I'm okay at it. I'm not the best, so I'm trying to get better so I can actually have content on my channel. I'm not the best at doing my drawings and stuff that I do on my phone, but I'm getting better, and so that's what I'm currently working on.
Okay.
I try to spend every few moments that I have cultivating my talent, but yeah,
So your talent is drawing?
I wouldn't say it's a talent, but yeah. And I try and make the most of the time I have doing that. Although it's sometimes I will leave out space for other things I need to do.
Okay. And I know that you have a talent of like music, choreographing different little skits and kind of like songs and stuff like that.
I don't
But
think
okay.
so.
I think you do. You have a gift of creativity and imagination.
Well, yeah, I do like to create stuff, but like not on the music side. I like to listen to music and dance to music, but like not really create music.
Okay. What about sewing? Because you're very, very creative. So,
Oh yeah, I like sewing. That's fun. I have a sewing machine and I'm taking a class for that now. So
okay. Well, that's awesome. So, as one of the, I guess, parental figures in you guys' lives, I will definitely share this podcast so that the adults in your life know that what your talents are so that they can continue to cultivate them because education is really about learning things that you're good at and perfecting them, and also exposing you to things that you may not even know about, but in learning about them, they may pique your interest so that you'll want to learn more and explore them. So, this time of academics and education is all about exploration and adventure. And so that's what we want to do in our homeschool. We want to make it a little bit more adventurous and give you new opportunities to explore new things. Is there anything that you want parents to know about giving kids a chance to learn things that are interesting to them?
Well, you can expose them to different mediums and things, and soon enough you'll find out what they like. It's not exactly the best method as it takes quite a lot of time, but hopefully it'll work.
I think you should. So if you give your child some freedom to do, like I know parents probably already do that, but like if you give your child a little more freedom than you already do, maybe they will find something they like to do and they'll tell you, and you can try and encourage that more in what you're giving them to do for school.
I like what you just said about encouraging your kids. Do you feel that your parents encourage you guys? Um, would you you do feel like they do encourage you, or you would like to see more encouragement, more praise, and more pointing out things that you're doing well?
I have a lot of encouragement, and thank you for that.
I don't know.
I don't really have an opinion on the amount of praise. I don't really like praise that much, but I just don't think there's sometimes there's not enough resources available currently. So yeah.
When you say resources, you mean to do the things that are interesting to you?
Yeah.
So do you ever say, "Hey, I need this app or this tool"?
No.
Do you think if you told your parents, they would provide that?
No, not really.
Well, I think it could be helpful to tell your parents what you need so that together you all can figure it out.
Okay.
All right. And what were you going to say about it? Amira, do you think that parents should give their kids more praise and encouragement?
Well, yeah, because like if you want your child to do well in something, then you have to encourage them, even if you don't really want them to do it. You should still let them do it because you gotta let your kids experiment with stuff.
You're so right. Because it's important for kids to learn on their own and make mistakes sometimes.
You're really a fan of unschooling.
Do you think it's okay to make mistakes sometimes?
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
We all do it. It's okay.
It's a part of learning, right?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Well, thank you, girls. I think you did an excellent job of communicating about unschooling because it's kind of like an abstract concept that for kids can be hard to really grasp. But I think you guys did a good job of really understanding how it relates to you. And thank you. Thank you for this conversation.
Mm-hmm.
You're welcome. Wait. And that's all, folks. Enjoy your day.
Welcome to another episode of the Cleverly Changing podcast. We are really excited about today's guest, Akilah. And so I am Elle and
This is Miriam.
And today we are going to be talking about self-directed education. So definitely listen in. And Akilah, can you introduce yourself so that our readers, I'm sure many of them will already know you, but definitely please introduce yourself for those who may not know all that you do in the community.
Sure. So my name is Akilah S. Richards, and I'm an unschooler. First and foremost, myself, my partner Chris, and our daughters Marley and Sage, who are about to be 16 and 13. We've been unschooling for, I don't know, since 2012, before we even knew that it was called unschooling. And I also host a podcast, an unschooling podcast called Fear of the Free Child, and a network called Raising Free People Network, where I collaborate with communities and individuals and collectives around what it means to raise our children outside of harmful, toxic spaces, which often include conventional school.
Awesome. So we want to ask you, you mentioned that you're an unschooler. What brought you to the unschooling side?
I love that question. My children did. Marley and Sage, let's start with Marley because she's the oldest. When she got to the age where we put our children in school, she was really excited because she was and still is a very sociable person, loves being around lots of people, very outgoing, very much our resident extrovert in our household. And so she was super excited about school. And once she started, she was doing really, she took to it in terms of academically, and got labeled gifted and talented really early on. And then Chris and I were like really excited, the whole typical parents thing, like, oh my God, the school said we have a smart kid. Yay, let's do everything the school says to, keep her smart. But we started to realize over time that while she was thriving academically, emotionally she was not. She was becoming a different type of person. She was becoming apprehensive about asking questions. She was comparing herself to other children in ways that were really unhealthy. She was even, as a result of how the teachers and the staff were giving her all this extra attention and labeling her the smart kid, it was causing a divide between her and other children. And she was looking sometimes at other children as less than. Like for example, she'd be like, well, why can't they read, mama? Like, why wouldn't they know how to read? Because of course everyone around her was like, you can read, you're awesome. And, we had to sit and be like, well, your mom works from home. And so I had time to work with you on these things where someone else's parent might not. It doesn't mean that you're smarter than they are. It doesn't mean that their parents care any less because you don't see them at the school all the time or the kid can't read. So we started to recognize all of the different ways outside of grades that the schooling environment, which now I call schoolish culture, how those things were damaging for the whole person. And then when Sage, our youngest, started school shortly thereafter, there's a very small age gap between the girls, a very similar thing started to happen with her. And so they both were pushing saying that they did not want to go to school. And of course, Chris and I, particularly as like traditional Jamaican people, you know, coming here, migrating from the US or from Jamaica, and, you know, coming here with the idea that you come to get as much education as possible and all of that, we couldn't even really hear them. We're just like, okay, honey, well, we'll talk to the teacher, or you need to adjust, and all the things we do. And then eventually we realized that we had to be available for the whole child, not just the student version of our kids. And so we eventually honored their request and stopped schooling and started to do homeschooling or school at home, until we realized that we didn't need that either, or Marley and Sage didn't need that either. They actually just needed space to learn more about how they learn, and for Chris and me to observe how learning was happening and to support that. And so we very organically, over the course of a couple of years, transitioned from schooling to school at home / homeschooling over to self-directed education, which unschooling is one type of self-directed education.
Right. Okay, well, since, you know, the children were pushing for a different style of education, did you all really have a difficult time, you know, honoring that request? Did you all go through any period where you had to, you know, struggle within yourselves, even just to figure out what's the next step in the
Of course.
forward?
It took us 2 years, like 2.5 years of them being in school and complaining pretty much from the very beginning, before we even were like, oh, okay, I guess you could do something else besides school, because in our brains, learning happened in school. You know, you needed a teacher, a certified, qualified person to teach you, and you needed to go through these processes, and you needed these books and blah, blah. So we call that deschooling in the unschooling world, and deschooling is still happening for Chris and me, and we've been doing this for years. So we struggled with it a lot. We weren't clear about how learning would happen if they weren't in school. And even when we took them out of school, as I mentioned, we were doing school at home. We were still assigning them things. We were still doing testing. You know, we were still doing all of those things, believing that we needed to create an environment for learning to happen. So we definitely struggled with those things. And as the girls push back, we'll push back too. You know, like because we thought that's how that worked. Kids didn't want to do all the learning stuff, but our job as their parents was to like make them do it. So we did that for years, Miriam, until we, again, in the middle of doing all of that, pushing back and forth, we were also observing our daughters. And once we started to see the ways that they were learning outside of what we were giving them to do, and sometimes because we weren't, especially for me, I'm not like the most detail oriented person, especially if it's something I don't want to do, like create a lesson plan. I'm not going to be the best at like following up, okay, we're going to do this at 7 p.m. or 4 p.m. and then I'm doing it either half stepping it, or we forgot to do it that day. You know, the typical things that happen when you start homeschooling. And I, you know, in my mind, I was like, okay, I'm not doing a great job at this. They're not going to learn nothing. They're going to be stupid. And then it turns out that not only did they learn things, they were a lot sharper than I could have fathomed. They started learning new languages on their own. They started teaching us so much. We started learning more about their personalities and the ways that their personalities were indicators of the type of ways that they learn. We just started to deschool and learn more about schooling outside of a classroom, outside of a classroom setting. And that over time is what, you know, sort of, we worked with that instead of our fears and instead of the indoctrination from schooling. So yeah, we struggled, but we also learned a lot, and that learning a lot is what oriented us towards self-directed education.
Wow. I think for me, what you said about observing your kids, I think that was so powerful, because for me, in my experience, from the moment we had our kids, that's when you start teaching them. So that segue into self-directed education, or just teaching your child from home, is kind of natural, because like you've been teaching your child all this time. Mm-hmm. So what the main, I guess, gift of homeschooling or unschooling or just being with your kids in a different way is that you get to observe them and you get to see how they learn best. And so I
Yes.
love that you mentioned something that I think I really value from the experience, and that's I learn from them too. You know, it's
Absolutely.
not just a one-sided experience. It's on both sides. It goes both ways.
Yeah, yes. And for us, what's different from homeschooling as opposed to self-directed education is that I don't consider myself a teacher of my children. I'm not teaching my children, actually. Of course, there are things that they learned from me, just as like you and I, if you and I were spending, whichever one of us, Elle or Miriam, if we were spending time together in each other's physical space, we would learn from each other. Same thing. And then because you and I are come from different places and have different experiences, there's some things that you could teach me about that I wouldn't otherwise know anything about, and vice versa. Same thing. So when we talk about teaching our kids as people in self-directed education or unschoolers, there's no curriculum involved. We're not determining what they should learn, even if we really, really, really think it's something that they ought to know. We don't enforce it. We introduce it. We do a thing called strewing, where we bring different things into their environment. And so a lot of the work is about observation and not teaching, but learning, because learning is something that someone does for themselves and they can select a teacher. And sometimes that teacher is me or Chris, and sometimes that teacher is someone else, or sometimes it's not a person, it's an environment that they need to be in. Sometimes it's completely intuitive and they don't need to be taught it, they just need space with it so they can learn it. So those are the type of observations that we have, you know, like all the different ways that teaching and learning happen outside of a constructed exchange.
I love it. I think
Right.
I think, you
I'm
know,
just listening like, oh.
it's like you can soak up so much. What's funny to me is one of the questions that we get asked the most is what curriculum should we use? And I know
Yeah.
that unschoolers and self-directed people who follow that method aren't necessarily into curriculum. And I know that we consider ourselves eclectic because there are some things that we do want our kids to learn, and we do, you know, kind of enforce
Push
it.
them.
Yeah. But at other times, I feel like we're very relaxed about it in general, because it's like we want them to be free. You know, I love where you talk about the freedom of it all. And I think as someone who was raised in traditional schools, it's hard to let go. And
Yeah.
so do you have any tips for parents who believe in the philosophy? Like, we definitely, on one hand, we can do it, but then on the other hand, we're like struggling to let go and be.
Definitely. And I can so relate to that, because that's exactly where Chris and I were in a lot of ways, and in some ways still are. You know, again, it doesn't ever, because we've all been I call it indoctrinated into schoolish culture. I don't know that we can ever fully release it, but just like any other responsibility you feel like you have, the fact that it's difficult has nothing to do with whether or not we commit and recommit to the decision to do it. And for us, when I say us, I mean Chris and me, we really, it's not just about education. Of course, there are things that we really, 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 really want Marley and Sage to pick up and learn and focus on. But more importantly, we're cultivating a relationship with them, and we're raising Black women. So for us, the idea that we're raising Black women who become accustomed to someone controlling aspects of their lives is unacceptable for us. And we do not want them to believe that because someone loves you and has power over you, that they get to determine what you do with your time, or that they can better tell you how you learn than you. Because so many other things in our culture in terms of society will tell them that. Our job is to help them develop what I like to call confident autonomy. And confident autonomy means that they have the capacity to discern whether, if we're pushing them in a certain direction, to say, look, I know you don't have interest in this thing, but I really feel like at this stage in your journey, this is something that is critical. It's something that you may not love it, but you probably need to be introduced to it. They trust us because we don't force. At this stage, at 16 and 13, they trust us enough to say, okay. And they do it the same way that sometimes they push back against something and say, mom or dad, you need to trust that we're doing what makes sense for us. And if this doesn't work out, we have to trust that we can pivot in a direction that makes sense. And then Chris and I got to be like, oh, okay. Even though we really just want to use our power over and be like, no, you're going to learn this today. Like we're building, it's more than learning. We're cultivating a relationship of trust and confident autonomy. So my tip would be to think about the whole relationship and not just the information. There's an information exchange that we become committed to, but you're exchanging information with a whole person. And if you want them to be to trust you and to feel also that they can trust themselves, a big part of that is to give them the room to not know something and to be like, is that going to be okay? Because most times it is. Or for them to hit a brick wall and say, oh, wow, I don't get this. And that did feel crazy, or I felt inadequate or whatever. And now I do want this information. And for them to know that the way information works, especially today, you don't have to hoard and have all of it before you go out and do a thing. You can trust yourself to develop skills and trust your parents and all of that along the way. So that's the major tip. Look at the whole relationship and not just the information.
I like that tip, but the big tip came a long time ago. Can you say it again for the people in the back? Okay, so when you were saying that we're raising Black women who are already being told by the world that they're not enough and that they have to be lorded over, and teaching them how to exist within that world and not succumb to that. Man, I
sort
can't
of that
even
narrative. No, you're doing great. Just that narrative, right? Like that narrative, that performative way of showing up. Yes, all of that. Like we perform for the white gaze, we perform for the corporate gaze, we perform for all these different gazes, and some of them we don't have a choice. Like when we talk about the legal gaze, police, and we don't have much of a choice in that one because that's a safety life issue. But in many other ways, we absolutely have a choice. And that's why we take our children out of school, whether we homeschooling, unschooling, or whatever. We never start, because we recognize the toxicity of that gaze and the way that we perform. So it's really important not to bring those same tools, I call them tools of oppression, bring those same tools of oppression right back into our household and then expect to raise free people, because you can't use tools of oppression to raise free people. And that phrase came up because Chris and I sure were trying to use the tools of oppression to raise free people, and it just was not. It's like, well, why don't you feel comfortable doing it? Because you own my time, that's why. And it's like, okay, if we're gonna say we're raising free people, that freedom also needs to include ourselves. So what are some of the ways that we are oppressed by our fears, and how are we transferring those to our children under the guise of education or parenting? And we all do it to some extent, and unschooling is the process of recognizing that and doing the work to shift that. And then deschooling is like the deeper work of really seeing how you as the adult, all the ways that you are not free, and how that lack of freedom is translating to your parenting style and what you can start to do about that. So I love that you pulled that part out, Miriam, because it's such a huge part of why we unschool. Yeah.
Yes. Thank you so much. So wise. So wonderful.
Yeah, it is a lot of wisdom in what you say. And I feel like when you were talking, for me, what stood out was the trust aspect. And I think while you're teaching them how to trust themselves, at the same time, you learn how to trust yourself. And I feel like, I don't know, too much about your background, but I know that for me, being the youngest, I wasn't necessarily given a lot of space to trust myself. It was usually like people just told me what to do and I did it. And with my kids, I wasn't that much of a risk taker on my own, but with my kids, I want them to be able to take calculated risks and be able to decipher and reason on their own. And I think in our culture, that can be frowned upon, and in some regards.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And so how do you trust yourself to trust what you feel like is best? And I feel like that's what you guys have done. You've kind of reconditioned yourself, so to
Absolutely. And I love that you asked that question. Thank you so much for asking it. So we learned, and Chris will say the same thing and has said it on the podcast many times over when we do things in community live. We talk about how we learned those skills through being with Marley and Sage. They didn't need to be taught how to trust themselves, Elle. They know how to do that because that's human. We, as the adults, from all different backgrounds, yours is based on being the youngest, mine is actually based on being the oldest. Like the level of responsibility that I had meant that I was just supposed to tap into like what is, as opposed to like really feeling it through and developing something for myself intuitively. That came way later, like way later. And a huge part of how it came was from being around Marley and Sage and seeing the ways that they were not afraid to make a mistake, because they hadn't had the indoctrination of feeling punished by not being right all the time, because they were only in school for a few years. We also saw their own deschooling, the ways that they had to unlearn, and they talked about it. Marley in particular, as the older one, has spoken repeatedly about the ways that she is deschooling from some of the schoolish ways that affected her just for the short time she had been in school, and then also that her parents were two highly schooled people who really put certain things in her mind before we began unschooling. We were doing, more conventional homeschooling, and that had its own harmful aspects, because it said, oh no, I'm trusting you, but I'm only trusting you like this. I'm trusting you to learn these things right here that I think you should learn. And she talks about how that was such a mixed message for her, because it's like, well, do I cultivate a learning style that's for me, or do I do what pleases you and then do what's for me like after that? What? So I was like, oh, when she would ask that question, I'm like, I don't know, just study what I said to study, and then after a while we had to really reckon with that and be like, wait a minute, that's not, it can't be both. Like you can't serve both masters, like you can't. So for me, I learned to trust myself from seeing how Marley and Sage trusted themselves. And I was developing very slowly, very painfully, tools for dealing with my own fears. So in other words, whenever I had an issue with something I thought that they should be doing or should not be doing, I learned how not to make that their issue. I learned how to question myself and to go back and say, what is it about the fact that she just will not read the autobiography of Malcolm X that's triggering me? And what do I think will change in life if I force her to read it, to the detriment of our actual relationship? What is that about? What do I need to work on to shift that belief? What if I trusted that the information wasn't just locked in this one book, but in several types of conversations and in different, that to do that sort of, that's what deschooling is, to not weaponize your feelings and fears and turn them into something your kid has to deal with, but to really be introspective and to get with other adults like what we're doing here and being like, girl, what you do when you feel like this? Or what happens in this moment? Or your kids are older, can you tell me, if you didn't force them to do this, how did that work out for you? Not that it's going to work out for us the same way, but just for us to have examples. So that's what we learned how to do. We learned how to view our fears as exactly what they were, not these valid things that meant that we could now tell our children what to do. It was something that we could work with to say, where are my self-trust issues and how are they manifesting in what I think my kids need to do so that they don't deal with the same things that I dealt with? Why is that potentially problematic? And what can I do differently? A series of those sorts of, call it mad question asking, that, we do these MQAs, just like ask yourself these questions alone with other people. And then what you start to recognize is that a lot of the things that we do in the name of education are really just fear-based things that if we handle them, then we can really see how our children don't need the level of structure that we tend to put there. That's for us. That ain't for them. That's for us. Like 9 out of 10 times, that's our stuff.
Man, it's interesting how so many things that seem unrelated, like, do you trust yourself?
Yes.
It has absolutely everything to do with it, but it has nothing to do with school and learning, but it
Right?
does. It's integral. And so when you said, teaching them to trust themselves, I was like, yeah, they do. They already know how to trust themselves. They come out knowing how to trust themselves. They tell you when they're hungry, when they pee, when they poop, when they're uncomfortable, when they're sleepy, and they're trusting
Exactly.
the feelings that are happening. As they grow up, we're teaching them how to squash that, and we're teaching them how to question themselves and not trust what they already, inherently feel deep down.
Exactly. And
Push
we're
that to the
replacing
back.
like
Don't worry about it.
conversation, the things that, for example, when you have a little one and they know themselves, but then there are things they struggle with, like they might not want to take a nap, and they need a nap because they're cranky and they're itchy and they're saying all the things, and you just know they need a nap. So those things come up, and we don't have to force. We have the conversation. We say, Marley, the reason that this is happening and you're receiving this like this because you're tired. So you're going to go into your room, and you don't have to sleep if you don't want to, but you're going to be in that room for that stretch of time. And you really need to, see what that feels like differently than if you just run around until you pass out by the fireplace somewhere. See how that is for a couple of days and see if that makes a difference. Those are the things we did. And then they, in many instances, they self-regulate. I mean, so many instances, it floors me every time. Like, for example, when we got to the point of when we removed bedtime, because it was very incremental for us unschooling, because we're Black and we're Jamaican. So we were very much like, you do this at this time, this time, this time. So it took us some years to really do that transition. And bedtime was one of the last things to go, because we're like, that's crazy. Kids need to know when they need to go to bed. And I don't want to see them after this time because I'm tired, blah, blah, blah. So we got to the point where it's like, if we're raising people who are confidently autonomous, they also need to be able to recognize their own boundaries. I don't want them to be, 20 before they understand what fatigue runs through in their body and what that looks like. They should do that in the safety of home. So we removed bedtime. It was very, very scary in my mind because it was my sacred time also, and they were much younger back then. So I'm like, oh my God, they're going to be like up and making sounds? So, but we did it. And what we realized, like Sage, our youngest, she was like, no bedtime, up, turn up. Like she was up to like stupid o'clock. And we were like, this is foolish. We made a mistake here, all the things. But then come to realize over time, she got really clear about what would happen when she needed rest in her body. And as an artist, she's very particular about how she uses her time and the time of day that she's doing these different things. She self-regulated. And then I also learned through another unschooling mama about Ayurveda and about people's different, like the makeup of people's bodies. They're called doshas in Ayurveda. And Sage has a particular dosha that people of that dosha, they fast often, which Sage does, and I've been trying to force her to eat something. And they also have periods where they don't need rest in the same way that someone with a different composition would need it. So she was doing what was very organic for her, and because I was ignorant to it, I was trying to force her into something else. But had we not trusted the process, she and I would have had our own issue, because I'd constantly be like, you need to go to sleep, and she'd be pushing back against that. But instead, we both learned something, and she now goes to bed whenever she needs to go to bed, and I don't care when she goes to bed. She doesn't need anything from me. She's happy, I'm happy. We're both in our own bodies, regulating our bodies. Now this is a skill that she understands about herself.
Yeah, I love that you brought it up, because I think some families who don't regulate bedtime and give their kids that autonomy around when they want to go to sleep. I think some people just in American society is like, what? You're letting your kids run amok. You need to regulate that. That's what we're told. And I think, just hearing you say that you allow your kids to regulate themselves in that way is kind of freedom. And it like some mom somewhere just said, oh my gosh, I'm glad that somebody else does this because
Yes.
this is what feels comfortable for me. And, you know, that's the whole thing about parenting. What works for one family may
Right.
not be what's best for another. Like you
Yep.
have to find what is comfortable for you and your kids and your family. So
Absolutely, absolutely. And you have to be honest about what your needs are, because for some parents, they might feel like that's not something that I'm prepared to do because it feels like it might cause more turmoil than good. Because again, like for me, where that time was so sacred and I was so scared that I was just going to be horrible to everybody in all the land because I needed my sacred time to really look at that and say, okay, that's important to me, and I don't need to like sacrifice my whole life for my kid to be as free as possible. I can have a conversation with my kid and say, I do want you to have this space, whether they're 7 or 17 or 6 or 5 or whatever. That's the other thing, people feel like kids might not know or they might not be able to accept it. Yeah, they can, because I know people my age who can't understand basic stuff. That ain't because they're little. That's because people are talking and I'm like, they ain't got no sense. So it's like you can have these conversations at different levels and talk about what your needs are as the adult, because unschooling is not a free for all. They do whatever they want and you try to figure out how to make it okay. That's not how that works. That's a different thing that we see lots of white families do, that we paint everything as the picture of unschooling. What unschooling means is that we're partnering. It means that I want my child to have practice with owning their body, owning their time, owning their learning experience, knowing how to tap into the resources around them, like me and their father and the community, for what they need. Knowing how to hold their boundaries. How will they learn all of that if we're regulating those things for them? You know?
right, right. And I think that's the perfect segue into our next question, which is, can you explain how self-directed education is different from free-range parenting?
Yes. When you asked that earlier, I was like, yes, please ask that question. So to be like super duper candid about it, and I'll give you this candid generalization and we can go a little bit further. The free range one, that's like the white people version, right? And of course, that's a generalization. It's not all white people, but generally speaking, it's those sort of like, my children should do whatever they want, and there isn't a level of regard about how that affects other people. It's just about freedom. It's freedom without responsibility. What we are talking about when we say self-directed education, we are, freedom and responsibility are it's two different sides of the same coin. They go together. So it's not a do whatever you want. It's self-directed education just means that it is derived from your interests and your curiosities, and that you're not being forced to do anything. But it also does not exclude a responsibility to the people around you, what we call community. So in our household, community starts with just the four of us: me, Chris, Marley, and Sage. Community also extends to grandma and grandpa, or if they're in an agile learning center, which is a self-directed education center, and my girls spent about a year there, then it means the other students in the self-directed education center, as well as the adults, the facilitators. Community means all these different things. And so your actions, you are free, but in that freedom, you also have a responsibility to your community. So if you feel like you're so free that you can't wash no dishes, which means that other people in your community would have to pick up your slack, that's not what unschooling or self-directed living and learning looks like. Because in that instance, you would have a conversation with the people in that community and say, this isn't working for us. What needs to happen? Why is it that you don't wash the dishes? Is it the time of day? Can we shift something to make that easier? Or what are the consequences that are inherent in you not doing your job? Not a punishment, but the consequences, because a punishment comes from a person. A consequence comes from when you don't hold your own in a space, and then there are things that are inherently lost in that. So those are some of the ways that they're different. One of them tends to be more of like a free-for-all without the level of responsibility. And then self-directed education is very much about, in a community, how does each person live and learn in ways that do not compromise that person's needs, but also don't encroach upon what needs to happen for the community to, for everyone in that community to feel safe and heard and seen. Does that make sense?
Yes, respect and responsibility are two
Yeah,
key factors in self-directed education that may
absolutely.
not be so much in the free range activity.
Right. And the terms are interchangeable because I love the term free range. I actually really appreciate it because I love the idea of thinking of a farm, and I love the idea of thinking of animals roaming and people, like this ecology of different things that do what they need to do organically, and that it can work together organically, as opposed to school where it's so standardized, where it's like, these are the things that work, anything else is a problem. So we can reclaim that. Just like unschooling is a term that I love it, a lot of people don't like it because it sounds like it's anti-schooling. I like it because it absolutely disrupts the idea that schooling is where learning happens. But we also don't need to buy into what we've seen in white culture and say, oh, well, this is what it is, so we can't do it. Freedom is not a white thing, it's an everybody thing.
Right. Everybody. Okay, so let me ask this question. So for anyone who is, kind of not sure how they really feel about unschooling, if it's something that would or would not work for their families and lifestyles, are there any books, articles, anything that you can suggest to help
Yeah,
them, figure out how to test the waters?
absolutely. Yes. So the first one, particularly for my homeschooling fam, is to just the simple act of doing less, right? So before we even get to the external resources, let's talk about the resources that are right in front of us already. To do less. So if you have a curriculum and there are particular aspects of it that you already know tend to be the one where your kid pushes back against it, stop doing that one. Like, just try that. Just simply try that. Because what happens is the more room you leave for observation, right, the less of the space that you fill with the things you think they should be doing, and the more room there is, the more room there is for you to start to recognize, oh, that's a me problem, as Marley likes to say. That's the you problem. That's the first thing that I would say. Where are some opportunities for you to stop doing the most so that you can start seeing what's really happening? That's the first thing. The second thing, of course, I'm going to say raisingfreepeople.com, which is my website, because the podcast is there. And on the podcast, there are more than 150 episodes of interviews with families who do this. And they're all Black, Indigenous, and people of color. We have a few white folks on who also support BIPOC families, because that's how we roll on Fair the Free Child. We absolutely center ourselves because it's important. So you'll hear from a bunch of different families who do this in a bunch of different ways, because as you said, Elle, it's not like a one size fits all thing. It looks different ways for different families. So I would say listen to those episodes. Some people have books they recommend. I'm not really into that, but if you can also always look up unschooling books. I also have a book coming out, but I like for us to think outside of just reading, because that's also a very schoolish idea that if you're well read, then you'll be well informed. Not for everybody. I'm a reader, but not everyone is, and not everyone needs to be. But I am coming out with a book called Raising Free People, and it'll be out in the fall of this year. And also the Alliance for Self-Directed Education. I'm a happy, proud board member of that organization, and it's self-directed.org. It was organized by a few of us, including Dr. Peter Gray, who a lot of people will recognize that name from researching self-directed studies and how learning happens. That's a group of us who our full commitment is to normalize self-directed education for any family in terms of access and what it looks like. So if you go to that website, you can read a bazillion and one articles if that's what you're into. You can join the forums and talk to people in your city. We have an initiative now about local SDE groups so that you can form or join a group that's in your city. So those are some of the tools for you to kind of get your feet wet and start to feel it out in community.
That's awesome. And I just want to say that for us, for both of us, I think when you started your journey, Miriam, your podcast was one of the podcasts that I was like, you have
Yes.
to listen to this.
Oh my God, I was in love, man. I've listened,
Thank you.
listened from season 1, and it's been very
Right.
beneficial and eye-opening and very reassuring.
Good.
That some of the thoughts and feelings and questions that I was having, it's normal, and that it doesn't have to be this way. Just to be able to open my mind to the idea that it's not a prescribed.
Yes.
Yeah, it doesn't have to follow these exact rules, doesn't have to look just like this.
Sure doesn't. That's not even how people work. That's not how people work.
Right, because I was
absolutely.
thinking, how do I learn? If I want to learn how to crochet a hat, I will pull up a YouTube video and I'm going to work that hat out.
That's right.
Why do I need to, make one of my children learn the history of yarn and how the wool is pulled and spun?
Exactly, unless they actually want to. Right? Because if they're interested in it, they're going to want to. Like Sage actually knows those things because she's deeply into needle arts of all forms. So she can actually tell you the history of wool. That doesn't make her any more intelligent than another child who can't tell you that at all, but can tell you something else that they're deeply into. That's the thing. We don't have to force it, because if they're interested, they go in, okay? In. And then they want the whole world to know, because that's how humans work. We all work like that, different versions of that. So there's nobody that this isn't for. It's just a matter of what it would look like, because some unschoolers also use curriculum. Marley likes curriculum for certain things, and she'll let you know, so we can just use it, so it just really is like whatever works for your kids.
Right. I actually don't like curriculum. I don't think either one of us like curriculum.
Yeah, I'm not a big fan, but I see how it can be beneficial in certain spaces, in certain instances, how it can
be restrictive.
Yeah.
Exactly. It almost always is. Yeah. And again, some children will choose that. That's the thing that we need to remember. That structure, it doesn't mean there's no structure. It means there's emergent structure. The structure emerges as a result of organic connection, not something that is enforced. That's all it means. Yeah.
So we have one question left for you. And the question is, what educational legacy do you want to leave with your daughters?
So one where they embrace confident autonomy. One where they know that the legacy is the fact that they can make decisions about what they want to learn and what that process looks like with confidence and in community and with all the sense of competence and connection that there is. So yeah, that's basically what it is. I want them to have that confident autonomy to be able to learn whatever it is they're into, and to be able to tap into community to make that happen.
That's beautiful. Please, you already kind of did, do the self-plug, but can you just give us briefly where our listeners can find you, social media platforms? You already mentioned your website, but feel free to go ahead and say it again.
And we will leave it in the show notes as well. So if people go to the show notes, we'll definitely leave it printed there, but we want you to go ahead and say it again so everybody can know where they can follow you.
Yes, thank you. raisingfreepeople.com is the hub. And on Instagram, I'm at Fare of the Free Child, which is the podcast, and it's FARE, as in the cost of raising a free child. We also recently started a Facebook group for the podcast so that we can go into each episode far more deeply. I'll send you that link so that could be on the show notes page. It's FOFC Podcast. And then lastly, I'm on Patreon because my network is a donor-run model, and really excited to have, I think now maybe 115 patrons who make sure the show can happen every week. And that's patreon.com/Akila.
Awesome. Well, it's been a true pleasure, a true honor to have you on our podcast. And I just feel like you're always full of a wealth of information. And I know that our listeners have enjoyed the conversation just as much as us.
Indeed.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm just so happy that you all are doing this. You know that I believe that anybody sensible should have a podcast. Like, I'm always pushing people to podcasts. I think we don't have enough, believe it or not, podcasts, especially about this work of, you know, raising our children and ourselves in liberatory ways. I'm always excited to be part of that. So thank you so much for having me. Thank you for doing what you all are doing. And I absolutely enjoyed the conversation. It just felt like we were hanging out on the couch, chatting and laughing, which is so important.
So that's awesome. Thank you so much. And we wish you the best. We wish Chris and the girls, you know, just listening to your podcast, it feels like
We're one of the family. I know.
Yeah,
Like, I know you
love
guys.
it.
like you guys are our cousins.
That's the whole point. That is the whole point. So you saying that is a wonderful affirmation. Thank you so much.
All right. Well, take care.
Bye.